Good morning. We are starting a new Thanksgiving series, as you can kind of pick up. I want to say just personally, thanks to you guys too, because I was in Latvia and got to see a lot of the work that is taking place there because of your generosity and your giving, as well as we see so many things even coming back here. But it makes a tremendous difference there with those people, as it provides an opportunity to reach many who don't know Christ and to reach a lot of needs around them with people who really are in need in that country. So I just want to say thanks. And from the leadership there in Riga, Latvia, echo their thanks because they are very, very grateful for your generosity. Hey, we are doing this series because one of the things that I've noticed, maybe you've noticed this too, is that people, they change, and there's this gratitude that comes out of their lives because internally they stop and they see things differently. Have you ever noticed that? And so because of that, it changes the way they understand their own lives. But most of the time when I'm around people and you see this tremendous change in how they see things, it also is attached to how they see God Himself. And there's this gratitude, this thankfulness that comes looking at their own lives, so they become grateful for who they are, but it's attached to the fact that they are grateful for who God is and the things that God has done. And it just sort of changes the way they see life, changes the way they see things. Now, I'm not saying it's not attached to circumstances. It is a lot of times. A lot of times it's those circumstances that sort of grab someone's attention and causes them to look at life differently. But most of the time, I've noticed that it causes them to see themselves, their own life, as they see God, and they just look at it differently. They look at their family differently. Wouldn't that be a great thing? They look at their neighborhood differently. They look at their, what they have in a totally different light, and many times look at what they don't have in a totally different light, saying, I'm really grateful that it's this way. When I was in Europe, a guy asked me, started talking to me, found out that I was a preacher at first. Because of that, they wouldn't talk to me. And then after, it's true, and after about a day or so, they realized, you know what, he's actually, pretty normal as a person, and makes a lot of mistakes, takes the wrong turn, just like I do, and things like that. And so we got to start talking, and they started asking me about my life and things like that. And I said, one of the things I've learned is that God doesn't give me a lot of stuff because He knows it's the best thing for me. See, have you ever thought about it that way? There are a lot of times I want things, or God give me this, or I want to be like that person. And God actually causes me to understand and look at my life and say, the truth is, I've not given you a lot of things. I've withheld a lot of things from you that you say I want because I know what's best for you. Have you ever noticed that in your own life? And really, God's a lot smarter than I am about what I need and what would make me the person, that I was really created to be. And sometimes when you realize that, it makes you stop and give thanks not only for what you have, but also for the things that you don't have. And the things that you thought you wanted, and you later realize, God knew what He was doing. And God had wonderful plans, and I'm grateful for how God has kind of looked after me and how He has seen, my life and made, decisions for my life that were the best things for me. And so I want to take you this morning as we start this out to a guy named David in the Old Testament, King David. And most of us think of David as being, the guy that slew who? Goliath. You can say it again. Who slew who? Okay, I just want to make sure you don't get mad. And the Philistine giant, and we think of David as being the second king of Israel, and there was a great contrast between David's life and the life of the first king of Israel. Do you remember his name? His name was, that's right, Saul, and big difference. In fact, God even says when He chooses David, I'm going to raise up a king with a heart that's like mine, who after my own heart. And what that did not mean was that David didn't have any problems. It did not mean that David never did the wrong thing. But what it meant was that God saw something in David and was going to build something in David, especially later in life, catch this, later in life, that Saul it didn't happen in Saul's life. Saul went the other way in the latter years of his life, and David was going to go sometimes through his difficulties and his struggles and the things that David really didn't want to have to deal with, but he found out that God was with him and God would shape his life. And so I want to take you through Psalm 139, and yes, if you've looked at your outline, we're going to go through the whole psalm. It's not one of those 150-verse psalms. Just hang on. We're going to go through the whole psalm. We're going to go through it pretty quickly, but I want you to catch David in this psalm as he writes some of the changes that you might not have known if you looked at this, because you've heard some of these verses, but you might not recognize some of the things that went on in this psalm. So here it is, Psalm 139. This is what it says. It says, and this is David writing. He says, "O Lord, you have," say this with me, "you have searched me and" what? Wow, that's a pretty big jump as David realizes there's a God in heaven, and God, you're not just the one who created everything in some massive, but you have searched me and you have known me. And David is actually, as we read, you're going to see, talking about intimately, God, you know me. Now that can be a very threatening thing, right? That God knows you intimately. Is there any person that knows you intimately? I mean, the depths of your thoughts and your motivations, that can be a pretty threatening thing. And I think as you read this, you're going to see that David sort of went through that stage that is a threatening thing. Look at the next part of that verse. He says, or verse 2, he says, "You know when I sit down and when I" what? He says, "You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path," and that literally means my getting up to go somewhere and my lying down, "and are intimately acquainted with all my ways." And it doesn't just mean, with where I have been, but all my ways means what's going on in here. This, when he says the sit down and rise up and the getting up to go somewhere and the come back and laying down, this is a rhetorical term called Mair Ism. And if you are a literary person or you know anything about poetry and language and all that, anybody here know what Mair Ism is? Anybody? Because I'm going to call on you and get you to come up. No, okay. The hands went down quickly. Mair Ism means that you identify parts of something in order to explain or reveal the whole of it. So what in Mair Ism, you say, getting up and lying down, to not just recognize that God knows when you get up and you lie down, but that He knows everything in between also. And it's a term, you see him use it twice, he's going to use it a third time in here, that is used to tag the parts in order to grab hold of or describe the whole thing. If you were in a wedding, right? And maybe you had these traditional vows at your wedding, and the pastor says, "Repeat after me," and you repeat your vows, and somewhere in those vows, you say something like this. The pastor says, "For better, for worse, for better, say it with me, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health." See, that's Mair Ism. That means the extremes, but what it means is you are committing yourself for the whole thing. Not just the extremes, right? But for the whole thing. And I was doing a wedding one time, real fancy wedding, a lot of money in both of these families. And the guy was very well-to-do also, and it's one of those funny ones because when I was asking her to repeat her vows, I use the traditional vows too. And I said, "Repeat after me," and all our friends are there. I say, for better, for worse, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor. And she choked. I mean, she could not talk, and she couldn't catch her breath, and she's laughing. All of her friends not only start laughing in the way, and they go, "Yeah, that's right. She's not going to say that." It is an absolute riot, because they said, we know her way too well, and he's laughing and everything else too. Because it just doesn't describe the extremes. It means everything in between. And David is saying this. You know me from the extremes, and you know intimately everything about me in between. In fact, when David says that you have seen me from afar, he's not talking about distance. He's not talking about, well, God's up in heaven and God has seen me down the earth. He's talking about time. He means that, God, you knew me, from the beginning, way before I was even created, and afterwards you still know me. He's talking about God's understanding and how David is beginning to recognize and understand. In this psalm, he's obviously reflecting back, but as he began to recognize the scope of what God understood and the scope of who God was, how that was in one sense frightening, but at the same time, big deal, very comforting. In fact, look at the next part. I may change how you understand this psalm. Even before there is a word on my tongue, and it means even before he had thought about or framed his language, he said, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before. Now, this word for enclosed, David is literally saying, you have hemmed me in. And this is not initially with David that good a thing. It kind of means, God, you've confined me. You've kind of, cut off the boundaries to me. You've sort of, and a lot of people feel this way. You talk about God, you talk about a God who limits you, It's just too narrow. I mean, who God is. But that's what he's actually saying. He says, you have, put it up there again, you have enclosed me behind and before. You laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge, such understanding is what he's saying, is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. Literally, he's saying it is just too lofty. I don't even understand this, and I don't understand the implications of this. And as I look at my life, I'm really not sure that I really like the implications of it. I know that when we go back and read that, usually we speak of it in the positive, and for David, it became that way. But initially, as God begins to understand who God is, it's pretty confining. It's fairly threatening who God is as far as who David is. Do you ever feel that way? You ever feel like, the fact that God knows everything, that could be a threat? Maybe a little too confining? We are Americans, right? So we have or at least most of us are, as far as I know, we have a Constitution, and that Constitution was written by men to guarantee that individually in this country, you would have from the government some, do you know what the word is? Some privacy, some freedom, that the government could not come in and just know everything about you. The government does not have the right to dig into everything about your life unless there is, by the law, unless there's an evidence that you have, clearly committed, some criminal act, or lately if you're a pastor. But besides that, I'm sorry, I'm just picking at terms. I know. You don't know the local things about that. But that was the whole point, that you have responsibility for your life, and that you should have responsibility for your life, which means a big brother cannot just come in and ask or check or confiscate or knock in the door, just whenever they feel like doing it. They do not have the right to do that. And so humanly, I think that the reason our framers, built it that way is because they realize, just innately in human beings, we have that desire, right? You like that? You want everybody to know everything about your life? No. You want some private time? Sure you do. There's one thing about coming back home is, I have my own little space, and I have, where I can go and grab my television, and my wife, who is here, she'll let me, actually turn on sports, just for a little while, on Saturday, 12, 14 hours, and, get to watch, whatever I want. And besides my chihuahuas, who always invade my privacy, because they don't understand, you want some private time. David's saying, I realize, God, there's no such thing with you. You know everything about me. In fact, you know me intimately. You know what when I get up, when I go to bed. You know when I decide to take a journey and embark on something, and when that sort of closes out, when that is done. And that just kind of blows me away when I realize that there's nowhere that I go, nothing that I do that you don't already know. Even before I get there and have done it, you already know what I'm going to do. You already know what I'm thinking. Is that scary? There's a part of that David is actually saying, man, I'm not so sure about that. And I'll be honest with you. When we acknowledge that and we realize that God is that intimately acquainted with all of us. I'm not just talking about if you're a Christian. You can say, I don't even believe in a God. It doesn't change the fact that God is intimately acquainted with you, everything about your life. Then he goes and say this. He says in verse number 7, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? And David is actually saying in this, I can't get away. There's no way I can go and find a place to hide or just get away and that you are not already there. In fact, look at verse number 8. He writes, if I ascend to heaven, that means if I go, he is talking space here. If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, or some of the translation would say down to the depths, he says, you're there. If I take the wings of the dawn, I like this because you know what he's saying? If I could move at the speed of light, that's what the dawn does, right? All of a sudden the dawn pops up, the sun comes on the horizon, and you don't see light just kind of gradually, there it goes, yeah, there's another little light beam, right? No, the dawn comes up, and what happens with the light? It is there. As far, light travels. Does anybody know how fast light travels from your schooling? Light travels at 186,000 miles per second. And that's what he's saying. At the speed of light, pow, man. That's how fast you travel. He said, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea. And for David and for the Hebrews, the depths of the sea were the ultimate to them physically of the place you wouldn't want to go and that no one can go. And they viewed the seas, the Hebrews especially, as a people, viewed them as just really kind of bottomless and never-ending, and don't really want to have anything to do with it. The Hebrews were never big seafaring people. I mean, they had fishing boats, and they talk about being on the sea, but most of the time when they're talking about fishing boats and being on the sea, they're, on the Sea of Galilee or something, which is really a giant lake. It's not the ocean. They would look at the ocean and say, who would want to go there, all right? They didn't do Caribbean cruises because they kind of viewed it as, if you drop your sunglasses or your wallet, it's gone. Don't even look, because the depths of the ocean, they just go on forever, and it is just nothingness and just, because if you look in the ocean, that's kind of what it seems like. That's the way they looked at it, the way they viewed it. I was on, I tell the stories of getting a chance to travel with my daughter when she was on a naval vessel, and I'm up on the bridge on the outside part of it where the captain sits. He has an outside chair, and I'm sitting up there, and I've got my Maui Jims on. I'm cool. I really am, because all these other people, they're in uniform. I'm in, jeans and a shirt and got my glasses, and I am really, really cool. And, I have these lightweight Maui Jims that my wife gave me. They're made out of polyester. I knew they'd do something good with that stuff eventually. And you can hardly feel them. I'm sitting on there, and a blast of wind, because when you're out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you're 1,000 miles from any shore, the wind can be powerful. All of a sudden, a blast of wind. Pooh, and it was like my glasses were fired out of a cannon. Choo! I wasn't cool anymore. I'm telling you, I was like, and I yelled at the sailors down on the deck who were trying, they didn't have anything to do. They were getting jets and things to, lift off and on. I was like, my glasses, and they were, 100 yards away, but they flew over their head and into the ocean. And I'm like, do we have divers, rescue helicopters, something that, my glasses just, they're like, that's, they're gone, That's, I said, what if I fell overboard? They'd say, we would go, oh, gone. It's just the way it works, The depths of the ocean. He's saying, man, in the highest heavens, if I were to fall into the depths of the ocean, you would be there. Look at the next verse. You didn't know all that was in that verse. It is what he says, even there. Now, here's the turn. Here's David beginning to change or make this turn, because he says, even there, your hand would lead me. And this is the kind of turn you have to sort of make. And your right hand will lay hold of. This is the kind of turn. Listen, when you have to come to grips with who God is, this is the kind of turn that you have to make. To realize it's not just I can't get away from Him. And God is confining. And God is threatening. And God won't let me do what I want to do. And I don't get any privacy, to deal with myself. Because there are things I wouldn't want anyone to know deep down. God knows. And God is not there to hold me back or to stop me. God is there actually to lead me. And that's why He knows me intimately. Because He doesn't just want to say, get up and go over here. God wants to deal with the part of me that decides where I'm going to get up and go. What I'm going to do. How I look at life and how I view life. Now, I know you think, what if I don't want that? But here's the deal. Listen, if God doesn't get in and deal with that part, you're never going to be a person who can stand up and really give thanks for your life. Because you can't really give thanks for who God is. And if you can't really get up and give thanks for your life, let me tell you this other little side of it. This may sound a little tricky, but it's absolutely true. You're never going to be happy. You're never going to be happy. If you can't stop and give thanks for your life, which means you have to deal with God and who He is also to be able to do that. You have to make this turn that David is talking about. That God, I know that you see everything. And my initial reaction is that's pretty threatening and that seems confining and that seems, just narrow. But now that I realize it, it's actually freeing. Because everything about my life you see. And everything about my life you understand and you know. You know the good and you know the bad. And they're both there. And you made me, you created me this way because you have plans for me. And because you have plans for me, you don't ignore me. Instead, you know every single thing about what is going on in my life. Just think about it for a second. If you looked at life that way, if you saw your life that way, and you viewed your life as something that God made me, He created me this way, and God is intimately acquainted with all my ways. Because you don't become intimately acquainted with things that you don't love, that you don't have plans for, that you don't really, this is just, I'm passionate about. You don't become intimately acquainted for things unless you feel that way. And so if God is intimately acquainted, with me in that way, even though I may look at my life and say, I wish I had that life, or I wish I was like that, or God, I want that. All of a sudden, everything, just like David, everything begins to turn and everything begins to change based on now how you actually understand God, because it changes how you actually understand yourself, how you see yourself. Look at the next verse. He says, if I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and this literally means if I say, surely the darkness will hide me. In other words, God can't get to me through the darkness, and the light around me will be like night. Even, he says, the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as day. Darkness and light are alike to you. And what it really means is he's saying, even in darkness, it is as if it is light to you, because the darkness does not hide things from you. He's talking about the physical darkness, but the reality is, David's also talking about, because he had it in here just like you and I do, even the darkness that is in here sometimes that I'm afraid will cover up the good or will overwhelm me or somehow will cloud out my life. Even, he says, God, you see through that, which now I realize that's actually a good thing. Because light, in a sense, because God sees through it, light comes in even when I look and say, there's no light. And yet there is, because of who God is and what God sees. Next verse, he says this. He says, for you formed me in my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. And you got to, think even David might have understood some of the weaving, because to weave something is an intentional act. It doesn't mean it just happened, right? Or God says, I created the earth and you just kind of happened because I created life or the earth. No, David's saying, I realize, that you actually wove me together. If you think of your blood vessels, maybe as part of the weaving, your bones, your ligaments, the strands that make up, the muscles, they're all there. And he's saying, as I look at those things, even though David didn't really have, probably the medical or the physiological understanding that we do of the human body, David understood enough to say, man, if I just look at my life, even when I was in darkness in my mother's womb, you were weaving my life together. You were building the strands and putting me together. This is how David understands physically. He describes how intimate God was acquainted with who David was. And he said, and he makes this change. It's a big change. And he says, first time in this psalm, I don't know if you realize it before, as you read this psalm, there's a change here. And for the first time, he says, I will what? Give thanks to you. I will give thanks to you. So from a threatening thing, from I'm not sure about it, David all of a sudden has turned to realize, no, this is not a bad thing. This is actually my rescue. This is what brings meaning to life. This is what changes me. I will give thanks to you. He says, for I am what? You know this verse. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Now if you read the psalm again, I encourage you, maybe today or this week to pick it up and read it again. You will see a tremendous, as David reflects back, tremendously he talks about this kind of change in his understanding or how he sees it because of who God is. And if you look at David's life, this is absolutely characteristic of David's life. You know the story of David? He was one of Jesse's sons. And David was a shepherd boy. He was the youngest. And so whenever the father and the sons went for official business or to do things, or even when they went to war, the brothers were warriors and they went out and fought for Israel. But not who? Not David. David was left back to take care of the sheep. Where his brothers, had spears and swords and bows and arrows. One day they would be on video games, and things like that. David is back there, just, with sort of a minimal shepherd's clothing, and all David carried with him was a staff that a shepherd would carry, and his one weapon was a sling. You got some rocks, David? Little leather strap. That was it. That's David's life. And it's one of my favorite stories, to tell when the prophet comes to anoint the new king and he narrows it down from Israel down to their tribes and families, gets down to Jesse's family. New king's going to come from there. He goes to the oldest because he's the biggest, strongest warrior, and God says, no, not him. And he goes down son after son after son. He gets to the last one that Jesse brings of his sons, and God says, no, not that one. And then the prophet's going back and going, God, there are no more sons, How does this work? I don't understand this. And I'm sort of reading into the story a little bit here. Just to let you know, if you go back and read it, I didn't see exactly that. I'm reading into it a little bit. Because the prophet actually asked Jesse, I'm not reading this in, says, is this it? And Jesse goes, well, yeah, there is one more, We left him with the sheep. You don't want him, He's not going to be king material. He is the one that, go get him. And as I always tell it, the brothers weren't real happy with this because the youngest, the scrawniest one, incidentally, he was a redhead. And he's called the ruddy one. And they went, they have to go, the prophet says, go get, the little rascal, back with the sheepfold. Somebody go and get him and bring him, and no one gets to sit down or eat until he comes. I knew it. That's the older brothers, Man, we have to stand here for hours and hours waiting on him again. He's always, messing things up. This is David's life. And as David looks back and reflects on his life, he begins to realize God understood and God saw something different about David, who he was, what his potential was, what God wanted from his life than David could possibly ever see. Don't you know David loved telling this story? One day, there was a day, and listen, go back and read it. David didn't say, I used to be with the sheep, but I knew I would be king one day. He didn't talk like that at all. He was like, he totally changed everything. And then who? God. And David becomes so bold, the little scrawny guy, when Goliath is out there, if you know the story, he shows up. No one in Israel's army will go out and do battle with Goliath. And David says, I'll do it. And they're going like, you are really embarrassing us, little brother. Don't say things like that. I'll do it. And Saul, in his desperation, he should have been the one to go. Saul says, well, here, put on my armor. And David says, I tried it on. It just doesn't work for me. I don't understand this. I've never known how to fight, in this way. Yeah, well, then how are you going to take on Goliath? He said, well, I just tell you, when I was in the field by myself, left out there by my family, he said, God always protected me from the wolf and the bear. God was always with me. He said, I'll go out with the same confidence because the Goliath is challenging God himself. How can I lose? Because it's not really me against Goliath, it's Goliath against the living God, and the living God is always protecting me. He says, I will go out. And of course, you know the story. He wins. And I love it because I like to listen to or watch scientific things, and there are always scientific programs where they try to explain, how did David do this? How did David take a rock and a stone? And they actually get out there and they test it with, people still use slings and all, and get the very best in the world, the greatest sling guy in the world, and they try to show, could he do it, and could you hit that? And, from about, 20 feet away, if you give him 20 or 30 throws, he finally can hit a mark and all that, and they're like, oh, it's just a lucky throw. Yeah, right. You'd get a lucky throw, too, if you were in that situation, right? And David just says, God just changed everything. And as I learned who God was, and I looked at my life, and I saw how God watched after me, He just changed everything. And it was stuff way too lofty for me. I didn't understand it. But God changed everything. Look at the next verse. It goes on to say, wonderful are your works. Change in language, isn't it? My soul knows it very well. Look at the next verse, verse 15. He says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. That's a huge change in how David sees his life. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written, the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there had not been even just, one of them. You saw this. You planned all this way before I even understood. And then David makes a change again, because now David does what you and I might do, because God has sort of drawn him in over time, taught him about himself, and now David goes back and does apply it to his own life. And these verses may seem kind of odd to you or a little scary to you, but then he goes and say this, next verse, he says, well, wait a minute, I'm going to get down to it. How precious are your thoughts for me? How vast the sum, if I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. No, I'm going fast. When I wake, I'm still with you. Next verse. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Because David now goes right back to the reality, the practicalness of his life. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. So David has taken this change over his life, and he still goes back to his own life. David is not saying, God, make everything work my way. But David is acknowledging, as he had to all of his life, there were those who would fight against God and be against God, and because of where David stood, David became their enemy. And he said, God, that you would fight and destroy them. Because, listen, this is what David is realizing. I can't do it. I can't go out and fix everything and fix the world. But God, you can. So even in his own difficulties, even in his own problems, maybe you're there, you turn this and you apply this. God, you are the one that changes things. You are the one who fights against those who would do evil and who would destroy. And they are there in the world. Sorry, that's just the way it is. But God, you're the one who does these things. And then he says this. I love these verses at the end. In fact, if you haven't memorized any verses lately, these would be some great verses to memorize, where David says, say it with me, search me, O God. and know my heart. Now, he just said God has and knows it, but he's saying again, but God, you deal with me. Say the next one. Try me and know my what? You got anxious thoughts? David had them. He's saying, God, I want you to put me to the test and know the anxiety of how I see life or how I think and I shouldn't. And he says, and see if there is any hurtful way in me. And then he says this last one, and do what? And lead me into the way that is everlasting. That would mean for David, God, you see everything, you know everything, you plan everything, you know the way because you have those plans because you are everlasting. That is the way that I want to go. That's what I want to follow. Even if I don't want to follow it, that's what I want to follow. But I need you to search me and you to try me and test me in order to move me in that direction. Because David understands, as hopefully you do, as a human being, without God leading and directing and searching and trying and dealing with, I will go the wrong way. My understanding is limited. I picked the wrong path. It looks right to me, but God is the one who leads in the everlasting way. Let me challenge you with a couple things. This is what people do a lot of times. They look around in the world and they say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to trust the world. I live in this world. It's a good world. Well, it's a lot of bad, but I'm going to trust. And so they look around and they say, I'm going to let the world search me out as I search out the world. And here's the problem. If you say, the world search me, you know what you'll end up being in life? You'll end up being disillusioned. You'll become cynical. You will look around and say, you'll challenge every motive there is. Because in the world, that's absolutely right. That's what we live in. And it always kind of, I know we live in the world. And you know, and in one sense, we love the world, we love our life, but at the same time, we don't. Because let me go ahead and tell you, this is not our home. Not if you belong to Him. This is not your home. This is just temporary. Say it with me. This is just not contemporary. This is just, it is contemporary too. It's just temporary. This is not it. So that means, when things are going good, you should be grateful, but you should say, I don't want to put too much hope in that because it's just what? And when things are going bad, you may say, and the tendency is when things are going bad to say it will never change, it'll only get worse. But you have to be reminded that this is just what? Temporary. Yes, it is. Because there's a different home. There's a different place. And David understood that because God was intimately acquainted with him, that David had plans for David. And they were bigger and better than David's plans. Second thing is you can do this. You can say, I'm going to search my own life. Because I don't want anybody else, going there, right? To the depths of my life because I don't want them knowing. I've said it before. I always, I think this is funny, but I do say it. I'll talk about, I have struggles and problems, and sometimes I'll walk out and somebody says, well, tell me about your struggles and problems. I say, because I don't know you. I don't trust you, God knows. But what David finds out is, I don't have to search out myself. I'm not even as trustworthy as the God who does search me out, who knows me. See, I think this is one of the things that people are absolutely in Jesus' day enamored with Jesus, is that Jesus knew, He understood, He knew the hearts of people, He knew exactly what was going on in your life, and yet Jesus was not a threat. Now, it is threatening to know that someone knows you that well, but then the more they got to know Jesus, the more they realize He knows me, and He's not a threat. He doesn't know me to harm me. He doesn't know me because He wants to make fun of me or, to make a fool out of me because I'm pretty good at doing that myself. He knows me because He knows what I could become. He knows what God created me for. He has plans. He is intimately acquainted with who I am, not just now, but in the future, just as He was. He knew me even before I existed, woven together. He knows what He wants, my life to become. And David is saying, you search me. This is David's surrender, his willingness, David's understanding of who God is. God, I know if you search me out, it's not going to end up bad. it's going to end up be a wonderful thing, a good thing. Even the things, when you search me out, that I don't really necessarily want you to get to, I know that you only get to those things because you have good plans, wonderful plans. And this is why if you look at David's life, David was a guy who really could give thanks. Because intimately, deeply, he could give thanks from way down in here to who God was. In fact, David got in trouble. I don't know if you know, he got in trouble with his wife because David ran out in the streets. He was the king, and his wife said, "Kings shouldn't act this way." Do you remember what David did? David ran out in the streets, and he did what? He danced in the streets. He was moonwalking. You know, he was dancing because of his joy of who God was and how intimately God knew him and how God led. And he didn't care if this was not kingly behavior. It was just his excitement and his enthusiasm before God. David would just go and dance, you know. I have a lady who's a good friend. She came up from a background where dancing was honky-tonk, drinking, and running around your husband. And that was her background in life. And she became a follower and a believer, and God just radically changed her life. And she would say every once in a while, even especially when that verse would come up, she said, "I know that it says David danced. I just know God hates it." And, you know, because that was her background. It was a negative thing. It was a bad thing. This is not the same kind of dancing, right? This is the kind of dancing that just says, you know, it's kind of like Snoopy and Happy Feet. You know, I just can't stand it when I realize just how much God knows me, the depths of it. It made me fearful. You ever done those fearful things? And all of a sudden, it wasn't fearful. It was exhilarating that God knows me that way. Let's pray together. And as we pray, let's give thanks to God for how well He knows us, for all the things that He has taken us through. That even as we look back, and if we look back and we're honest about our lives, God had plans for us that we never dreamed of, we never believed. And God has taken us through things that as we look back, we could never have navigated our way through those things. And God has given us wonderful promises about how well He knows us, how intimately He is acquainted with our lives, and how much God wants to lead us, to guide us, and even when He wants to search us out, He wants to lead us in the everlasting way, away from the harmful, destructive ways. Dear God, we thank You. We do give our thanks for who You are, and how in learning about who You are, it has changed also how we see who we are. Changed it dramatically. That You would love us and care for us, and You would plan for us just insignificant, organic life forms in a massive world and an enormous, overwhelming universe. And yet You would know us intimately. God, thank You for Your love. Thank You for Your Son, Jesus Christ, who rescued us and rescued our understanding as He gave His life for us. In Jesus' name we pray.